Welcome to Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad, a podcast dedicated to amplifying and elevating Afro-Latinx histories, cultures, and communities across the Americas and beyond. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Reed Vasquez. Join us for conversations with experts and artists to learn more about Afro-Latinidad. Venga! Today's guest is Dr. Victor Figuereo. He is an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work. He earned his undergraduate degree from Clark University, a master's in clinical psychology from Ball State University, and his doctorate from Boston College School of Social Work. He is the author of Racialization and Psychological Distress Among U.S. Latinxs, published in the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities in 2021. Dr. Figuereo's work focuses on ethno-racial mental health equity, with attention to diverse Latinx populations in the U.S. and the role of racialization processes in these outcomes. His work aims to demystify the ethnic and racial homogeneity of U.S. Latinxs, render visible the lived experiences of Afro and Black Latinxs, and contribute to the elimination of Latinx health and mental health disparities in the U.S. Victor, that's a lot, and we're going to unpack all of it. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much for having me. I look forward to our conversation, Michelle. Thank you.
No, me too. So you are Afro-Latino. You're born and raised in Boston in Hyde Park, among other places,
Yes.
To Dominican parents. And so just want to know a bit about your backstory and how you became interested in enhancing the visibility, talking about the experiences of Afro-Latinos.
Yes, definitely. Yep. As you said, born and raised in Boston to Dominican parents, and in Hyde Park. Shout out to Hyde Park, Mass. And I can't help but also shout out to other places I lived, like Dorchester and Rosendale. And so got to show some love to the city and neighborhoods of Boston. Also, just special love to Boston Celtics. I'm really excited for how they're performing right now in the playoffs. So you see the hat here, but that's just where I'm at. I'm in a good place. But my journey to my work around mental health equity among Latinx populations in the United States, in particular Afro-Latinx folks, is definitely both, right? Not only professional through my studies and how I got into research as an undergrad and continued that through my graduate studies and the opportunities that I was afforded. But it's also personal. It's also personal as well. As you mentioned, I'm proud Afro-Latino, and that wasn't always the case. I had to learn. For me, I had to learn that was my identity. That is my identity, and that I had to learn that I'm Black, right? Mm-hmm. And that wasn't. I grew up learning I was a lot of other identities, but Black, in terms of my ethnic identity and my racial identity, and me growing up, again, born to Dominican parents, being Dominican myself, there are a lot of racial terms used to describe one's phenotype, combination of phenotype that I was exposed to, that I was referred to, trigueño, indio, those are examples, but definitely not negro, right? Definitely not Black for me, from family members. And so growing up, when I would, especially like when I was old enough to fill out the census, right? White wasn't an option for me. I'm not white, but Black also growing up, I did not see that as an option. Again, with the way I was raised and taught about my identity. And so other was what I checked off for some time until I watched Henry Louis Gates Jr. documentary on being Black in Latin America, which I watched in when I was an undergraduate student at Clark. And it really had me reflecting about my personal experiences with Blackness and anti-Blackness. And again, that being acting on those, what I was taught in terms of being the Indio, and that contrasting with people outside of my family, my interactions with others, whether it's friends or people I meet, ascribe me as black. Like, I thought you were black. I'm like, oh, I'm Dominican, right? That
Mm-hmm.
would be somewhat of a common interaction growing up. And as well as negative experiences, discriminatory experiences, anti-black biases that I've experienced personally, being followed around in stores, for example, or jokes about my skin color, jokes about looking black or being black, and so watching Henry Louis Gates Jr. talk about the history of the transatlantic slave trade um, and the first arriving in Latin America
Mm-hmm.
and the Caribbean, and the history of anti black ideology, white supremacy, and mestizaje racial ideologies, being part of the history of these places such as Dominican Republic. Again, that helped me kind of just think about how some of that legacy in history makes sense to my personal experiences, what I'm experiencing with um, my own racial identity, and wondering, oh, why do people think I'm black? My family doesn't think I'm black,
Mm.
and what does that mean? And so that combined with um, seeing, I was involved in my undergrad with research around Latinx mental health,
Mm-hmm.
in particular access to mental health attitudes. I learned that a lot of the research, Dominicans and especially Afro Latinos were very underrepresented in mental health research among Latinx folks. And so it really got to a point where, you know, I was realizing that, like, you know, I'm Afro Latino, I'm Black,
Mm-hmm.
um, but the history of anti-Blackness and the legacy of it has really created such a dynamic which that was not a possibility for me to see or to embrace, or because of how stigmatized Blackness was.
Mm-hmm.
Blackness is in terms of how society treats Blackness and Black individuals and Black groups, and so yeah, all that led to a point of where there needs to be more research around mental health equity um, for Black and Afro Latinx populations. There's not a lot. And what does that mean for our well being,
Mm-hmm.
for Afro Latinx well being, not only their mental health well being, but their physical well being as well, given how mental health, right, influences physical health, and physical health influences mental health as well. And so, um, and the importance of racial identity in that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Given how one's you know feeling close and feeling proud of one's racial and ethnic identity can really be a protective factor against discriminatory experiences,
Mm-hmm.
to cope through some of those experiences, and to protect your mental health.
Mm-hmm.
um,
I want
and
to
so
I want to dig in a little bit because that's a
yeah.
lot, that whole evolution. And you mentioned the classroom, the undergraduate in this particular film, Black and Latin America. But I also am wondering about another moment that would have where it solidified. We were like, okay, I'm Afro Latino, I'm Black. This is how it is. Deal with it. Did you have a moment like that with family, with friends, with your professional world?
I don't know if I had a specific memory in a moment where I decided, like, no, this is how it is, and I'm moving forward. I think it's been more of a process
Mm-hmm.
that hasn't been linear, also because along the way, and there's still moments where I struggle with, am I Black? Am I Afro Latino? Like, and I think that part of that comes from, again, um, I think anti-blackness just right creeping up from society, from my past, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what I've been taught, and so I don't think there's been a moment, but I think for me it's just an intentional process and reminder, that I am Afro-Latino, and recognizing that it's for me, it hasn't been a linear process, or it hasn't been like a, it's been, um, in I think continues to be a process of reflection for me, to understand, well, what does it mean for me to continue, to be proud of being Afro-Latino, and to,
Mhm.
be in community, with folks who, are also Afro-Latino, um, and so, yeah. So I don't know if there've been, I think there've been different moments
Uh-huh.
in,
Absolutely.
along the way where, um whether watching the documentary and having conversations with, close friends, having conversations with, one of my sisters,
Mhm.
about her experiences with, um in her relationship with Blackness, and her own Afro-Latin identity, and and it's those conversations that, um that remind me, yeah, this is, I'm not making this up.
Mhm.
Like, I'm not the
Mhm.
only one experiencing. I'm not alone, right?
Right, exactly.
Um, and so yeah, that's just some thoughts I have about that. And that's where I'm at. Just
Yeah. No,
with that. So yeah,
yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing this. I mean, it's very personal. We talk about it, as a field of study, but it is also an identity and, our personal world. And so I appreciate you sharing that with us. And also, I'm really intrigued by the way that you took all of that and have channeled it into your professional arena. So I know that you're really passionate about issues of racialization, racial identity, mental health equity. So tell us a bit more about the evolution of that work.
yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned, I think I briefly mentioned, I, started out, in my undergraduate just looking into mental health attitudes among, Latinx folks in the United States, and at the time, right, my pro like the my I was focusing on Latinos as a homogenous group, because that's how, following the research, making sure as models, like, okay, yeah, these are, you know, influential studies, and so let me try to learn from them, um, and when I just started to become more critical and analyzing, well, who's missing, right? When we apply, um, lenses of intersectionality, it's so important to continue asking, well, who's not represented here, right? Um, and so I ended up just thinking about, well, I don't see Dominicans here represented. I don't see, um, any data on skin color or any data on race being separate from ethnicity. I had the opportunity to explore that in my dissertation, in my doctoral studies at Boston College, and, um,
And
was
just
able to,
and
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but just to be clear, so when you're looking at data on Latinos or the Latinx community, there's no it's all there's no disaggregate. It's all Latinos are all the same in the data. Is that accurate way to describe it?
yeah, the majority has been, yes, yes,
Mhm.
especially around 10 years ago or so, when I was undergraduate and started my graduate studies, and, um, there was, very little disaggregation of the data, very little, looking at, Latinx and Latinos, by race, right? Comparing, Black Latinxs with, their white counterparts, and, understanding well, are there, okay? Because what some of these findings, what some of these, studies would find, include that US born Latinxs are more likely to engage in, or are more likely to experience psychological stress, are more likely to experience worse mental health outcomes
Mhm.
compared to, their immigrant counterparts, their counterparts who were born outside the US.
Mhm.
And, and that, however, there wasn't
Nothing
any
else.
beyond that. And so what about, right, light skinned and white Latinxs, and darker skinned and black Latinxs, and, um, especially not only born in the U.S. but also, right, black and white Latinx immigrants themselves, right? And so, are you saying that, you know all Latinx immigrants are having, um, better mental health, are experiencing better mental health outcomes, are experiencing or are not experiencing negative lived experiences that could impact their mental health. And so, what was missing was, well, what about the discrimination, the anti-Black discrimination that happens for Black Latinx immigrants as well as Black Latinx? And so, yeah, and so I really wanted to use my dissertation as an opportunity to bring in uh, let's look at the differences in psychological distress between white white self-classifying and Black self-classifying Latinx individuals and adults in particular in the United States. And I also wanted to look at, well, how does this look like among different nationalities, and particularly Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and Mexicans in the United States. And so what was interesting was that for, in my dissertation, there's a couple studies that I did, and the one I was just mentioning right now, the data was showing that Black Mexicans and Black Cubans reported higher rates of psychological distress compared to their white counterparts, right? Compared to white Cubans and white Mexicans. But that didn't show up for Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. And so Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in that data had similar rates of distress. Black and white Puerto Ricans and Dominicans had similar rates of distress. And I found that to be really interesting. Of course, quantitative data, there's limitations, right? But I found it really interesting, and it reminded me of some research around racial mismatch, and in terms of how the data about race that was only collected in this data was self-reported, right? So we only know that the Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in this data set, we only know that they self-reported as either Black or white. However, we don't know how they are seen by others, how they're racialized by others.
I see.
Right? And so given how you'll have, regardless of whether we may self-report, we may see ourselves. Again, I didn't see myself as Black growing up. However, I was treated negatively as Black by others, right? People saw me as Black, described me as Black, and therefore followed me around the store, or therefore made jokes about my skin color.
Well, I want to just get into, you're discovering this information that's missing, and that's really critical for understanding issues of mental health equity in particular. And I'm wondering how your work moving from the dissertation into your more professional world, how your work helps us understand Afro-Latinidad and the issues that you work on in terms of racialization and racial identity and mental health. How does that help us understand the experiences of Afro-Latinxs and perhaps even kind of transnationally in Latin America, the Afro-Latin American communities? How do you think your work helps us understand better the issues that you are addressing?
Yeah, that Black Latinxs and Afro-Latinxs, it's important for us to pay attention to their mental health status and their lived experiences and how that can impact their mental health. And so we see that Afro-Latinxs have higher rates of psychological stress compared to their white counterparts. That's what some of my research shows. But there's complexity to it. There needs to be more studies and more understanding of how, again, not only self-reported race, but other dimensions of race, like Nancy Lopez's street race, like how does that aspect of racialization, how does that impact one's own racial identity? How does that then also impact how one interprets the discrimination that they experience and their well-being? And so right now I'm working on launching a study that is trying to understand these pathways and these mechanisms, how they all relate to one another in terms of the pathways to Afro-Latinx health and well-being. And so not only looking at psychological distress and self-reported race, but looking at different dimensions of race, looking at street race, looking at skin color, looking at racial attitudes, as well as discrimination experiences, psychological stress, depression, alcohol use as well. And so some of my work also shows that when we look at and compare Afro Latinxs with white Latinxs, it's also important to consider additional identities such as gender.
Mhm.
Um, um, One of my recent studies looked at alcohol use outcomes, in particular binge drinking, among Afro Latinx adults and white Latinx adults, but also looked at gender,
Mhm.
right? What role does gender and sex play? And found that, well, even though Afro Latinas and Latinos, both uh, men and women, even
Mhm.
though that they have higher rates of, excuse me, have lower rates of binge drinking compared to their white counterparts, we see that Afro Latina women have higher rates of binge drinking compared to white Latina women, right? And
Mhm.
so it's important to be able to see, well, continue to think about the intersecting identities of different Latinx folks, Afro Latinx folks, and how that might impact again their lived experiences and their mental health and their mental health outcomes. And so in this case, Afro Latina women feel more likely to binge drink, and that may be like we need to pay attention to, well, what does that mean when it comes to gendered racism and how that impacts
Mhm.
Afro Latina women and their health.
Yeah, that's a great
Um,
point.
mhm.
And just thinking about all of those pieces and the things that your research is revealing, what would you say would be kind of the most urgent issues we need to be considering? Obviously, you mentioned that kind of the gender, the intersectional elements of race and racial identity, racialization for Afro Latinx community, but what are there other kind of major issues that you've seen and said this has got to be the next thing I work on, or that scholars work on because this is really critical.
Mm. And so, yeah, what's something that we need to pay more attention to
Mhm.
is what you're asking.
Yes.
Yeah, I think about uh, how do we understand the impact of our racial attitudes, and that's what I'm hoping where some of my work can go. But I would love there to be more work around racial attitudes because of the impacts of Misty-Sahara racial ideology, and that being part of the legacy of anti-Black racism in Latin America and the Caribbean. Again, Misty-Sahara racial ideologies, right, being that uh, race doesn't matter essentially, right?
Hmm.
That we're all one race, therefore race doesn't matter. But we know that's not true. We see the impacts of anti-Black racism among darker skin and Black Latinxs in Latin America, in the United States, in the Caribbean, when it comes to their employment opportunities, housing, their health, and mental health. And so what does it mean to? So how are we accounting for? How are we accounting for racial attitudes in
Hmm.
terms of understanding the relationships of our racial identities and our mental health? Again, if you don't think race matters, like if you grow up and you internalize that race doesn't matter, um, how how will that impact how you're interpreting discrimination when it's happening to you, and how does that impact your your self-esteem? How does that impact your mental health? And excuse me. And um, so I think that's gonna be a really important uh, I think aspect of the research to really further to advance. How are we measuring? Is there a measure for? We know that there's a race neutral um, a measure of race neutral racism, of colorblind racism. What does it look like to develop a measure for Misty Sahara racial ideology, right? And I think the more we can advance that, the more I think we can understand again how does that impact mental health, but then what does it mean for advancing and protecting the mental health of Afro Latinx individuals, right? To promote blackness within the community, as a challenge to Misty Sahara racial ideologies. What interventions can be done around that, for folks who grew up like me, kind of who grew up like me, with internalizing that black equals bad, that it's bad to be black, even though I am, um, and then to help not only folks and younger folks with their racial identity, but again, how can we um, use these opportunities to promote blackness for the mental health, for increasing self-esteem and pride for their racial and ethnic identities. And so I think uh, we're looking at here, yeah, how can we protect and promote mental health equity and um, for Afro Latinxs, and the one of the last things I'll say to this point, I guess here, is what does that mean for clinicians as well? How can we prepare clinicians and helping professionals, especially those in neighborhoods where there are more Latinx folks? How can we um, promote positive Black identity among folks, younger folks, adults, um, uh, younger and older Latinx individuals? How can we promote positive Blackness, given what we know about the positive impacts of having a positive racial and ethnic identity, and how that impacts one's self-esteem, having higher self-esteem, and having a community, and how that impacts their mental health and well-being positively. And so, um, these are the connections that I would love for research in this area to go to again, uh, how can we better understand, again, multiple dimensions of race, in particular racialization, how that impacts racial identity, racial attitudes, um, our discrimination experiences, how we experience them, and how that ultimately, um, those pathways, how does that lead to our mental health and well-being? So we can have that can better inform how we develop interventions to promote Blackness um, within the community.
Yeah, because if you can identify the issues surrounding the treatment and opportunities and access, then it becomes easier to try to dismantle all of that and to make sense of your lived experience, for sure.
Yes, and how can we prepare clinicians and helping professionals working with Latinx populations
Mm-hmm.
to um, for that to be part of helping professionals' curriculums, education, that Latinx are racially diverse, and these are their lived experiences. It's diverse, and what does it mean? Well, to work with Afro-Latinos. What does that mean in terms of mental health treatment? And are you asking about their racialized lived experiences? Are you asking about race and more than just the typical question of self-reported race, right? Are you asking about racialization?
Mm-hmm.
Are you asking about um, different ways they may experience discrimination, how that impacts the lived experiences? And so, I think I'm hoping this work can also advance how we prepare clinicians and our healthcare professionals and our social workers. And so,
Yeah, absolutely. So my final question is always about kind of resources, getting to some of that for scholars, for the general population, for students. What kinds of resources, in addition to your, we'll share some of your links to your work, but what other kinds of resources would you recommend people who are interested in learning more about this topic, about Afro-Latinx mental health, racialization? What would you point them to, whether it's websites or social media or digital projects or films? Um, what can they go to gather more information?
yeah, I think about just some of the readings that have been influential from my work, and one of them is The Fallacy of a Raceless Latinidad, by Hector Adames and Nayeli Chavez Dueñas. And so that's one really helps to go into just some of the topics around racial identity, Afro-Latinidad, necessary racial ideologies. What does it mean? when it comes to discrimination and their mental health. And so that's one thing I think about. I think about it's interesting. UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute had a recent report around the Afro-Latino, about a profile on Afro-Latinos in the United States. And so that within itself, I think, is a great resource into understanding also a little bit more broadly about the population in the United States and where folks are. And apparently, something I didn't know, that is a large concentration of Afro-Latinos in Pittsburgh, according to that report. And so just really helps folks to know that, one, for Afro-Latinos, you're not alone, right? And for others who are not Afro-Latino, we're out here. And yeah, so those are just a couple of resources that I think about. I think about, Nancy Lopez's article on street race and leveraging multidimensional race and how that impacts physical and mental health status. Highly influential for my work as well.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. We will put those links to that information up on the podcast website. And thank you again so much for sharing your journey, personal and professional, with us, and for all the work that you do. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Michelle.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and hear more episodes of Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And go to michellereedvasquez.com to check out our episode resources and learn more about the Afro-Latinidad Studies Institute.